We're in the middle of a transition. You may have noticed there was an announcement on trade yesterday. You may also understand, and I'm sure that my colleagues from Japan and the UK have maybe noticed it in Spain. We're having a discussion about re-upping the Jobs and Tax Cuts Act from 2017. And the administration is in the middle of a transition, and every administration, dating back to the first one that I observed, or the three that I've observed, they all kind of go the same way. Things seem pretty crazy, and generally speaking, they settle down. Hopefully, the same occurs here, but we have to confront the elephant in the room. One being the Jobs and Tax Cuts Act has to be substantially reauthorized, or we're going to have about a $4 trillion impact on our economy in the form of taxes. Number two, we have to settle down the tariff and get to a fair place. I have no problem with any sort of reciprocal tariffs where there's a documented gap between our country and fill-in-the-blank country. Where there's clearly a deficit and inequity, I have no problem with trying to determine what an equitable outcome is. I'm not sure that, and I'm not in a position, I should say, to know whether or not the strategy that the administration has embarked on is the right strategy or not. But I will tell you this, there better not be anyone in the White House who recommended the tariff regimen that was put out yesterday who hasn't thought through the second and third order challenges that are going to follow. And frankly, if they haven't thought it through, they need to be replaced with somebody who has. I'm a generally positive person, so I'm going to assume that they have anticipated that, and we will settle it down, and we will particularly settle it down with our friends and our allies first. I don't care about being punitive towards China right now. Really don't. I don't care about being punitive towards Russia and any other communist country that's set on destroying democracy. I do care about generations and centuries old friendships where you have to take a look at the total relationship to determine what is fair and equitable. What does a fair and equitable trade mean? What does fair and equitable relationship mean? Maybe even outside of trade. And hopefully those who have recommended this path to the president have thought that through. Like I said, if they haven't, I hope their replacement will. Now, I also want to talk about this elephant in the room. And then I'm going to go to your questions. So in April, it was either late March or April of 2009, I had just won the whip. I decided to challenge. So I joined the legislature after I challenged a two-term Republican incumbent who was Civitas, who's linked to Americans for Prosperity, Legislator of the Year. So I challenged the most popular Republican in the state legislature to a primary in 2006. Why? Because he was also rated the most ineffective legislator out of 120 people. And I thought it was time to change. So I challenged him. Everybody said he was unbeatable. We beat him like a drum by a 2-to-1 margin. Now I'm in the legislature as a freshman, and I spent about a year observing the Republican conference, trying to understand why we had only been in the majority for one time in the last 100 years, and trying to understand why the Senate had never been in a majority, and the legislature had never been controlled by Republicans since the Civil War. And I discovered it was a lack of leadership, and it was a lack of focus. So I decided to propose a change of the House Republican rules, and then challenge the long-serving Republican whip, because I believe with the right focus and the right discipline and the right leadership that we actually could get to a majority. Why am I holding this magazine cover up? Because in March of 2009, I had my managing partner from Price Waterhouse, or at this point it was IBM Global Business Services, I was a senior partner in the banking practice, call me up and say, Tom, you know, we've changed our code of conduct, we've accommodated you being in the legislature, you're one of our top partners, we need you back, and we need you back full time. I just ordered a fried fish sandwich in the Senate Legislative Cafeteria. I love their fried fish sandwich to this day. And the time it took for that fried fish sandwich order to be filled, I told my senior partner that I was pretty sure that I could go back to work at Price Waterhouse or IBM or Deloitte. But I believed if that chamber had leadership, that we were going to have a historic opportunity for Republicans to take control of the state General Assembly for the first time since the Civil War. Now, why does that sound kind of audacious? Well, now everybody knows that 2010 was a watershed moment for Republicans. But a month later, 2 months later actually, from the time I had that discussion to quit my job and lead the legislature, this was the magazine cover. This was May of 2009, after Hope and Change ushered in the new era under President Obama, and they were in the middle of their transition. It was clear as the red and the stripes of that flag that they were going to overreach. It was clear. When everybody else thought it was the end of the Republican Party, 6 weeks after I made that decision, I was convinced that people were not going to be disciplined. They were going to hold my beer, watch this, go down the path of policies because they thought they had a mandate to change everything versus to change the main things that ultimately the people of America care about: the economy, homeland security, and national security. So I was right. I became Speaker of the House, and we ushered in one of the most prosperous times in North Carolina in modern history. Why does that relate to today? Because if we don't have leaders in Washington advising the administration on how to prioritize and how to effect change at a level that the population can absorb, and if we use expedience to accomplish things that we should accomplish otherwise through regular order, then we will potentially expose ourselves to the very vulnerability that I was convinced that Obama and a Democrat-led Congress was going to lead to. So I'm a Republican. I'm a lifelong Republican. I support the president implicitly. It makes sense as a lifelong Republican that you would always move heaven and earth to make a Republican president as successful as they can possibly be in the White House. But that doesn't mean that you line up and say yes to everything coming out of the advisors in the White House. It means when there's a good idea where you have consensus, you do it. You support it publicly to the extent it requires legislation, try to get it done. But when you have concerns with the way certain things go, it's incumbent on me as a member of the U.S. Senate to express my concern. That is actually a part of the advice and consent of the Senate. We think about it in terms of confirmation, but you should also think about it in terms of how you're providing advice to make that administration the most successful as possible. Now, I'll leave you with this. I think trade could be bumpy. I don't know. I think it could be argued that the inflation we're going to see is transitory before we see deflation if we don't get this right. We've got to work on it. But more important even than that, or as of equal importance, is that we have to get the tax package done. We owe it to the American people not to raise taxes. And if we fail to do it, it will be Republicans who will be responsible for one of the most massive tax increases in modern history. I don't want that record. So I'm going to be over there fighting for focusing on the main thing that got us to control all of Washington. And that was to address the economy, to address homeland security, and to address the national security threats that we have today. Once we get through those three, then you'll interest me in any number of other things that I would like to get done. But the main thing is the main thing. It's always the main thing. And when you address it, it's why you get reelected and you get trusted to continue to lead this great country.
Talking to my colleagues in Europe, they're asking me what is going on over there. It's a hard question to answer because I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. I think that's an overused word. What advice would you give me to tell them in terms of what to look ahead for, or what is going on, or what's going to happen next?
Well, I don't know. I think, well, that's what I said. Look, I would have never Well, here's what I will tell you. This is before the announcement yesterday. I did business advisory services for mainly Fortune 500 companies, either in banking, media, entertainment, telecommunications. If I were in the boardroom with any, or in a C-suite with any of the clients that I had in the past, I would say, talk to me in about 90 days on anything related to my advice on capital expenditures. There are too many unknowns to deploy capital right now. You'd have to be out of your mind, or you've discovered a secret to business that I just have never figured out. And so I can't say anything more than let's figure out how we can minimize the damage through the mutual assured destruction of escalating a trade war. Now, having said that, we're the ones who lit the candle. And I wouldn't expect any country to say, well, we'll take a little pain here because more broadly it'll help the global economy. That's not how it works, folks. And I'll tell you the other thing that doesn't work. You don't make a promise on making things better through an election cycle. This country was founded on the idea of having elections every 2, 4, and 6 years for a reason. We expect results, and we do not reward big mistakes. And so if you can't prove some incremental positive direction over a reasonably short period of time after an election, you're going to get toasted in the next election, and rightfully so. This country is not set up to say, it's going to be difficult for 5 or 6 years, but boy, 7 in the out years, it's going to be awesome. Right? I mean, let's just be realistic about it. I'm not criticizing anybody. I suffer the fate of being a practical business person. And so it's very difficult in this context. It's not so bad when you're in the private sector. That's kind of what they expect. But we're going to have to play it out. What I would say, now, like if I were advising, and this would probably sound like treason, but if I were advising those who have had these tariffs imposed, I'd say, okay, let's plan our move. First move's out there, let's plan our move. So let me get on the phone with some countries who have mutual interests and we have good trading relationships with. We shouldn't think alone. We should think as blocks. Let's put together something that make us bigger than we are by ourselves and have a response. Like I said, I treat totalitarian, communist, other regimes differently. I have a lot more patience with disrupting business environments with nations whose ultimate goal is to end our existence. It just seems like, they should fall in the back of the line in terms of me worrying about them. But there's a lot of democratic nations, some represented in this room today, that should be rightfully concerned. And what we need to do is see whether or not they're going to mass together. And maybe even, in an economic sense, mass with some of those very countries. Like, I don't know if this is true or not, but I wouldn't begrudge anybody for doing it. If it is true that China and Japan and South Korea and maybe Asia-Pac countries are thinking about, well, this is sort of trade, this is not democracy, military existence, this is business, I wouldn't begrudge them. I think they'd actually not at least considering a response as a coordinated multinational response. It seems logical to me. So I'm going to assume that the Secretary of Commerce is also thinks that that's logical and has figured it out, so that if you choose to do that, there's going to be a countermeasure. If there isn't, then their replacement should take that into consideration.